Tonight, we don't speak of wars fought on battlefields or of empires that fell to dust. We speak of a different kind of conflict. A silent war waged not with swords, but with ink. A war on thought itself. Imagine a list, not of criminals or traitors, but of ideas. A catalog of words so dangerous, so potent, that for centuries, the most powerful institution on earth dedicated itself to hunting them down, sealing them away, and ensuring you would never, ever read them. This was the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Vatican's index of forbidden books. It was more than a blacklist. It was a prison for the mind. It was the place where science went to die, where philosophy was put on trial, and where history was rewritten, one forbidden title at a time. For over 400 years, this index held the power to decide what humanity was allowed to know. It shaped the libraries of kings and the minds of peasants. It cast a shadow that stretched from the lecture halls of universities to the quiet corners of monasteries. But what if the books on that list were not banned because they were wrong, but because they were right? What if the ideas they contained threatened not just the doctrines of a church, but the very foundation of control it had built over centuries? The index was officially abolished in the 1960s, a relic of a bygone era. Or so they tell us. But the books were never returned. The vaults were never opened. The questions they raised were never answered. So before you assume this is just a story about old books and forgotten rules, ask yourself, what happens when an idea is deemed too dangerous to exist? It doesn't simply vanish. It goes into the dark. It waits. And tonight we light a candle and step into that darkness, because the most forbidden stories are the ones that are still waiting to be told. They are the ones that never truly die. They just wait for a reader brave enough to turn the page. Imagine a room deep within the walls of the Holy Office in Rome. No windows, just stone and silence. On a long wooden table, a book lies open. It is not bound in leather or gold, but in simple, worn parchment. A group of men in dark robes stand over it, not reading, but judging. This is the congregation of the Index, the final arbiters of truth, the gatekeepers of the human mind. Their task was not to understand a book, but to weigh its soul. Did it question the nature of God? Did it offer a path to salvation that did not lead through the church's gates? Did it describe a universe where Earth was not the center, where humanity was not the sole focus of creation? Each question was a nail, and with enough nails, a book was crucified. The process was methodical, almost surgical. A book, once accused, was passed from a local bishop to a theological consultant, and finally to the congregation itself. There was no trial for the author, no defense for the ideas. The words were the only things on the stand, and they were always found guilty. Once condemned, its fate was sealed. The title was inscribed onto the index, a final, damning entry. From that moment on, possessing it, reading it, even distributing it, was a mortal sin. Inquisitors were dispatched, not with torches and pitchforks in a public square, but with quiet, absolute authority. They entered libraries, monasteries, and private homes. They didn't need to shout. The index was their warrant. Books were confiscated, taken back to Rome, and locked away in a place known as the Secret Archive, a name that feels both honest and terrifying. Some were burned, but burning was a spectacle. The true power of the index was not in destruction, but in containment. By locking a book away, the Church didn't just remove it from the world, it took ownership of its danger. It became the sole guardian of the forbidden knowledge, the only one who could study its heresy, the only one who knew its true power. This wasn't just censorship. It was an act of intellectual alchemy, transforming dangerous ideas into a source of secret power. They were building a library of everything they told the world not to believe, and in doing so, they became the masters of not one truth, but all of them. It wasn't just theological texts that found their way onto the index. That was the great illusion. The Church wasn't merely protecting its dogma. It was protecting its monopoly on reality itself. Consider the astronomers. Men like Copernicus and Galileo, who dared to look through a telescope and report what they saw. Their crime was not blasphemy. Their crime was observation. They brought forth evidence that the universe did not revolve around mankind, that the heavens were not a perfect, unchanging tapestry painted by God, but a vast, mechanical clockwork of which humanity was only a small part. This was a terrifying thought. If the Church could be wrong about the sky, something everyone could see, what else could it be wrong about? So their works were placed on the index, not because they were scientifically inaccurate, but because they were theologically inconvenient. The truth was placed under house arrest, just like Galileo himself, left to grow old and blind in the shadows, a warning to any who might trust their own eyes over the received word. Then came the philosophers, thinkers like Descartes, who famously declared, "I think, therefore I am." A simple statement, yet it held a universe of danger. It suggested that the foundation of existence was not faith, but individual consciousness. That you could find proof of your own reality, without a priest, without a Bible, without a God. It was a declaration of intellectual independence. The Church could not allow it. If every person was the center of their own universe of thought, the Church could no longer be the center of everyone's world. So onto the index it went. Even fiction was not safe. Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, a story of poverty, redemption, and revolution, was banned. Why? Because it suggested that morality was complex, that a thief could be a saint, that the institutions of power, including the Church, could be unjust. It humanized the sinner and questioned the righteous. It gave a voice to the voiceless, and a powerful institution is never comfortable when the voiceless begin to speak. Each banned book was a brick in a wall built to surround the human mind, not to keep dangers out, but to keep curiosity in. The index was a testament to a profound fear, the fear that if humanity were left alone with its own thoughts, its own observations, its own stories, it would find its own way to the divine, or worse, realize it never needed a map in the first place. To understand the true reach of the index, you must understand the network that enforced it. It was a silent, sprawling web that stretched across Christendom, woven from the very fabric of the Church itself. At its center was Rome, but its threads reached into every cathedral, every university, and every remote monastery. The enforcers were not stormtroopers in black armor. They were often the most learned men of their time, bishops, abbots, and the heads of monastic orders. They were the intellectual elite, the guardians of orthodoxy, and they wielded a power far more subtle than physical force. When a book was condemned, the decree was sent out through these channels. An abbot in a remote German monastery would receive the updated list. He would then be required, under pain of excommunication, to search his own library, a collection of manuscripts that his monks may have spent centuries copying by hand. He would have to find the offending work, the one his predecessors may have cherished for its wisdom, and remove it. He would have to lock it away, or send it to Rome for final judgment. Imagine the quiet tragedy of that moment. A man of learning, forced to become a jailer of ideas. In the universities, the system was even more insidious. Professors, whose very purpose was to pursue knowledge, were required to teach from a list of approved texts. Their students were forbidden from reading the great thinkers whose names now define our understanding of the world. A student of science could not read Kepler. A student of philosophy could not read Spinoza. To do so was to risk expulsion, to be branded a heretic, to see your future dissolve into shadow. This created a culture of self-censorship, which is the most effective form of control. People stopped seeking forbidden knowledge, not because they were afraid of being caught, but because they had been taught that the knowledge itself was a poison. The desire to know was reframed as a spiritual sickness. Curiosity, the engine of all human progress, was redefined as a sin. The most effective soldiers in this silent war were the Jesuits. The Society of Jesus, with its emphasis on education and intellectual rigor, placed its members in positions of influence across the continent. They were the tutors of kings, the confessors of queens, the founders of universities, and they were fiercely loyal to the Pope. They became the eyes and ears of the Index, reporting on new and dangerous ideas, identifying authors who strayed from the path, and ensuring that the Church's intellectual borders remained secure. This was a system of control so total, so deeply embedded in the structures of society, that it became invisible. It was simply the way things were. The world of knowledge had been curated, edited, and presented as a finished product, with all the inconvenient chapters ripped out. But you cannot kill an idea. You can burn the book, you can silence the author, you can forbid the name, but the idea itself, if it is true enough, will find a way to survive. It will go underground. It will whisper in the dark. It will wait. And while the Index cast its long shadow over the official world of learning, another world was stirring in the shadows. A world of secret societies, of hidden manuscripts, of knowledge passed from master to apprentice, not in lecture halls, but in clandestine meetings. The Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the alchemists, these were not cults of devil worshippers, as the Church often portrayed them. They were networks of thinkers, scientists, and mystics who refused to let the flame of inquiry be extinguished. They saw the Index not as a holy decree, but as an act of tyranny against the human spirit. So they became archivists of the forbidden. They sought out the banned books. They created their own libraries, hidden from the eyes of the Inquisition. They translated the works of philosophers the Church had condemned. They studied the astronomical charts that had been declared heretical. They practiced the art of alchemy, which was not just about turning lead into gold, but was a complex metaphor for spiritual and intellectual transformation, the very kind of individual journey the Church sought to prevent. Their methods were cloaked in secrecy and symbolism for a reason. It was a matter of survival. A philosophical idea might be disguised as an alchemical formula. A critique of religious dogma might be hidden within the geometric symbols of a Masonic lodge. Knowledge became a secret language, a code spoken only by the initiated. And a strange thing began to happen. The very act of suppression by the Church gave these ideas a new kind of power. They became more than just theories. They became sacred trusts, truths so valuable that people were willing to risk their lives to preserve them. The Index had intended to create a world with only one story, but instead it had created two: the official story, told in the blinding light of the cathedrals, and the secret story, whispered in the flickering candlelight of hidden rooms. This secret stream of knowledge never stopped flowing. It moved beneath the surface of official history, nourishing the minds that would later give birth to the Enlightenment. The very revolution in thought that would eventually challenge the Church's authority was nurtured by the books the Church itself had tried to destroy. The index was a monument to the fear of knowledge, but the secret societies were a testament to its resilience. They were the living proof that no prison, not even one built of stone and faith, can truly contain the human mind's desire to know. Consider the strange case of a book that was never written, yet was so feared it was condemned by the Church. The Tribus Impostoribus, or the Treatise of the Three Impostors. For centuries, whispers of this text echoed through the intellectual underground of Europe. It was said to be the most blasphemous book ever conceived, a work that claimed the three great figures of the Abrahamic faiths, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, were not divine messengers, but clever manipulators, impostors who used religion to control the masses. The book, as the legend went, argued that all religion was a human invention, a tool for power. The very existence of such a text was a threat to the entire foundation of Christendom. The Church hunted for it relentlessly. Inquisitors interrogated scholars, searched libraries, and followed every rumor. Authors and thinkers were accused of having read it, or worse, of having written it. Yet no one ever found a copy, because for the first 500 years of its existence, the book was a ghost. It was a rumor, an idea so potent that it took on a life of its own. The Church, in its frantic search, actually amplified its legend. By condemning it, they gave it power. By hunting it, they made it real in the minds of people. They had, in effect, created the very monster they sought to destroy. This phantom book represents the ultimate paranoia of the index. The fear was not just of existing ideas, but of possible ideas. The fear that someone, somewhere, might dare to think the most unthinkable thought, that the entire system was a lie. The condemnation of a non-existent book shows that the index was not a reactive measure, but a preemptive one. It was an attempt to map out the very limits of human thought, and to place armed guards at the borders. It was a war not just on what had been written, but on what could be written. It wasn't until the 18th century, during the height of the Enlightenment, that someone finally decided to write the book. A text bearing the infamous title was anonymously published, a product of a more secular, skeptical age. But by then, the original fear had done its work. The legend of the Phantom Book served as a chilling reminder to generations of thinkers. Even your unspoken doubts could be heresy. It's a profound irony. The institution that claimed to be the guardian of the ultimate truth was haunted by a lie, a ghost it had summoned itself. It reveals the deep-seated insecurity at the heart of all censorship, the belief that if an idea is not controlled, it will inevitably lead to the collapse of order. The Treatise of the Three Impostors, whether real or imagined, was a mirror held up to the Church, and in it, the Church saw its deepest fear, a humanity that no longer needed to be saved. Imagine being a monk in the 16th century, living a life of quiet contemplation and scholarly devotion within the stone walls of your monastery. Your world is one of prayer, labor, and the painstaking preservation of knowledge. You spend your days in the scriptorium, surrounded by the wisdom of the ages, copying ancient texts by hand. Then, one day, a decree arrives from Rome. It is the latest edition of the Index of Forbidden Books. Your abbot reads it aloud, his voice heavy. On that list is a book you have spent years studying, a work of philosophy you believe brings you closer to understanding God's creation. Now, it is declared a danger to your very soul. You are commanded to take that book, the one you have copied with your own hand, and lock it away in a hidden chamber, never to be read again. This was the silent tragedy inflicted upon countless men of learning. The index was not just an external force. It was an internal one, a weapon that turned scholars against their own knowledge and librarians against their own libraries. It created a schism in the intellectual heart of the Church itself. There are records of monks who secretly defied the index. They would create false catalogs for their libraries, hiding the forbidden books under different titles or in unmarked sections. They would continue to read them in secret, by candlelight, risking their vows and their spiritual standing. These were not rebels or heretics. They were men who believed that knowledge, all knowledge, was a path to the divine, and that to deliberately close a path was a greater sin than to read a forbidden page. This internal resistance highlights the fundamental conflict the index created. The Church, as an institution, has two aspects: the administrative, power-seeking structure, and the spiritual truth-seeking tradition. The index was a tool of the former, but it did violence to the latter. It forced a choice between obedience to the institution and allegiance to the pursuit of truth. For many, this was an unbearable conflict. Some complied, their faith in the institution overriding their intellectual curiosity. They became the quiet enforcers of the system, their silence a testament to their loyalty. But others were broken by it, or chose a different path. They became the secret keepers, the guardians of the very knowledge their superiors sought to erase. They were the rogue archivists, the quiet dissenters who ensured that the flame of free inquiry was never completely extinguished, even within the walls of the institution that sought to control it. The story of the index is not just one of suppression, but also of this quiet, persistent, internal rebellion. It is a reminder that even in the most monolithic systems of control, the human spirit's desire to know will always find a way. A hidden shelf, a secret reading, a flicker of light in the deepest dark. While the congregation of the index in Rome made the final rulings, the true war on ideas was won and lost in a place far more intimate, the confessional. Here, in the sacred space of supposed forgiveness, the Church deployed its most effective psychological weapon. The faithful were required to confess their sins, and under the expanding definition of heresy, thoughts themselves had become sins. Did you read a book not approved by your bishop? Did you entertain doubts about a point of doctrine after reading a pamphlet passed to you in the market? Did you feel a stir of excitement, not fear, when hearing of a new scientific discovery? These were no longer matters of intellectual curiosity. They were stains on the soul that had to be confessed. The priest, acting as a spiritual physician, would then prescribe the cure, penance, prayer, and a firm command to burn the offending book and never again stray from the path of approved knowledge. This turned every believer into their own inquisitor, their conscience into a prison warden. The fear of eternal damnation was a far more powerful deterrent than the fear of earthly punishment. People began to censor their own thoughts, to shy away from conversations that veered into dangerous territory, to see books not as sources of enlightenment, but as potential traps for the soul. The system was brilliant in its psychological efficiency. It outsourced the work of surveillance to the very people it sought to control. The Church didn't need an agent in every home, when it had already placed one in every head. This spiritual surveillance extended beyond the individual. A printer who published a book that was later placed on the index would find himself in a perilous position. His business could be ruined, as the faithful would be forbidden from buying any of his works. He could be forced to publicly repent, to destroy his own stock, and to submit all future publications for pre-approval by a church censor. This created a chilling effect throughout the entire chain of knowledge production. Authors began to self-censor their work, anticipating what the church might find objectionable. Publishers shied away from any text that was even remotely controversial. The entire intellectual ecosystem became timid, conservative, and stagnant. The free marketplace of ideas, which had flourished in the Renaissance, was gradually shut down, replaced by a state-sanctioned monopoly. The index was the law, but the confessional was where that law was etched onto the human heart. It was a masterpiece of psychological control, ensuring that the walls of the mental prison were not only guarded from the outside, but were built, maintained, and even cherished from within. The greatest victory of the index was not in the books it banned, but in the minds it conditioned to no longer wish to read them. Not all forbidden knowledge was written in books, some was encoded in the sky. For millennia, humanity had looked to the stars for guidance, for meaning, for a calendar. Astrology was not the fringe pseudoscience it is today. It was a sophisticated system of cosmology, a blend of mathematics, myth, and philosophy. It proposed a universe where humanity was intimately connected to the cosmos, where the movements of the planets had a correspondence with the events of human life. This idea of a connected universe was profoundly threatening to the Church's worldview. Christian doctrine required a clear hierarchy: God above, humanity below, and a great, unbridgeable distance between them. Astrology suggested a different model, a web of connections, a universe of sympathies and correspondences, where the divine was not a distant king, but an immanent presence woven into the fabric of reality. If the stars could influence your destiny, did that diminish the role of God's grace or free will? If your personality was shaped by the planets, what did that mean for the concept of original sin? These were dangerous questions. The Church's response was to declare astrology a form of divination, a pagan superstition, and a demonic art. The great astrological texts of the ancient world, like Ptolemy's *Tetrabiblos, were not immediately banned, but they were reinterpreted, stripped of their philosophical depth, and reduced to mere fortune-telling. However, more esoteric and magical forms of astrology were relentlessly persecuted. Books on the creation of astrological talismans, on the summoning of planetary spirits, on the use of celestial alignments for ritual purposes, these were hunted down and destroyed. The Inquisition saw the astrologer not as a scholar, but as a sorcerer who sought to usurp God's power. Yet the irony is that the Church itself never fully abandoned astrology. It simply took it out of public view. Popes and cardinals continued to consult astrologers in private. The very foundations of cathedrals were sometimes laid according to auspicious celestial alignments. The timing of coronations was occasionally chosen with a careful eye on the heavens. The Church banned the public practice of astrology while reserving the knowledge for its own elite. They understood its power. A map of the cosmos is a map of power. By declaring the common person's sky to be empty of meaning, while secretly reading their own celestial charts, they maintained a crucial advantage. They presented the universe as a simple linear story written by God, a story of which they were the sole interpreters. Meanwhile, they kept the more complex, cyclical, and interconnected cosmic map for themselves. The banning of astrological texts was not about protecting the faithful from falsehoods. It was about ensuring that only the Church had the authority to read the heavens and to tell humanity its place in the universe. It was about replacing a sky full of meaning with one full of obedience. One of the most profound casualties of the index was the wisdom of the body. For centuries before the rise of a dogmatic church, medicine was a holistic art, a blend of empirical observation, herbal lore, and spiritual understanding. Thinkers from Hippocrates to Galen had laid the foundations of a rational approach to health. but their knowledge was always intertwined with a respect for the mysteries of the life force. The Church, however, imposed a new paradigm. The body was no longer a sacred vessel to be understood, but a source of sin and temptation, a temporary prison for the immortal soul. Sickness was not a biological imbalance, but a punishment from God, a test of faith, or the work of demons. In this worldview, the pursuit of medical knowledge became deeply suspect. The great medical texts of the ancient world were not immediately banned, but they were viewed with suspicion. Anatomical dissection, the very foundation of understanding how the body works, was decried as a desecration of God's creation. For centuries, physicians had to rely on inaccurate drawings and theories because they were forbidden from studying the real thing. This led to a catastrophic stagnation in medical progress. But the Church's fear went deeper than just anatomy. It feared the folk wisdom, the herbal traditions passed down through generations, often by women. These wise women, the healers of their communities, possessed a deep knowledge of the medicinal properties of plants. But their practice was not based on Scripture. It was based on experience, on a tradition that predated Christianity. This made them a threat. They were an alternative source of authority, of healing, that bypassed the priest and the prayer. So the Church rebranded them as witches. Their herbal remedies were twisted into demonic potions. Their healing rituals were called satanic pacts. The Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, a book that was ironically never placed on the index and was used by inquisitors for centuries, laid out the theological justification for this persecution. Books of herbal lore were burned alongside the women who owned them. A vast repository of practical medical knowledge was wiped out, replaced by a system where the only legitimate response to sickness was prayer and penance. The index and the witch hunts worked in tandem. The index erased the formal, written knowledge of medicine, while the witch hunts destroyed the informal, oral traditions. It was a coordinated assault on the body, an attempt to sever humanity's connection to its own physical nature and to the healing wisdom of the natural world. The goal was to make the Church the sole arbiter of both life and death, the ultimate authority not just over the soul, but over the very flesh and blood of its flock. The result was centuries of unnecessary suffering, a dark age not just of the mind but of the body itself. What if the most dangerous book on the index was the Bible itself? This sounds like a contradiction, but it lies at the heart of one of the most significant power struggles in Western history. For the first 1,000 years of Christianity, the common person had no direct access to the Scriptures. The Bible was a book written in Latin, a language only the clergy could read. The priest was the intermediary, the translator, the one who told the flock what the Bible said and what it meant. This created a perfect system of information control. But then came the printing press, and with it, a revolution. Scholars like John Wycliffe, and later Martin Luther and William Tyndale, began the radical act of translating the Bible into the common languages of the people: English, German, French. This was an act of liberation, a belief that every person had the right to read the Word of God for themselves. To the Church, it was an act of rebellion. The translation of the Bible into vernacular languages was immediately and ferociously condemned. The translated Bibles themselves were placed on the index. Why? Because a Bible in the hands of a common person is a dangerous thing for a controlling institution. If you can read the Scriptures for yourself, you might start to interpret them for yourself. You might notice that some of the Church's traditions and doctrines were not explicitly mentioned in the text. You might question the authority of the Pope, the practice of selling indulgences, the requirement of a priest to mediate your relationship with God. Direct access to the source code is always a threat to the administrators. The Church's reaction was brutal. Translators were hunted down as heretics. William Tyndale, whose English translation became the foundation of the King James Bible, was strangled and burned at the stake. Copies of his Bible were gathered in public squares and set alight, the smoke rising as a warning. The Church argued it was protecting the faithful from misinterpretation, that the holy text was too complex and sacred for the untrained mind. But the real fear was not that people would misunderstand the Bible, but that they would understand it all too well. They would understand that the kingdom of God, as described in the text, was a matter of inner faith, not outer allegiance to a powerful institution. The battle over the translated Bible was the central battle of the Protestant Reformation, and the Index was the Church's primary weapon. It was a declaration that the Word of God was the exclusive property of the clergy. By banning the Bible in the language of the people, the Church made its position clear. It was better for the flock to remain in ignorance than for them to have a truth that was not curated, controlled, and delivered by the institution. It was a desperate attempt to keep the gates of knowledge locked, but the words, once printed, could not be unprinted. The revolution had begun. The long night of the Index began to break with the dawn of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. A new spirit was moving through Europe, a belief in reason, in individual liberty, and in the relentless questioning of authority. Philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot were not just writing books. They were forging weapons for a new kind of war, a war of ideas against the old regimes of church and state. And the Index was one of their primary targets. Voltaire, with his sharp, satirical wit, ridiculed the Index as a monument to ignorance. He famously said, "I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," a statement that was the philosophical antithesis of the Index. His works, filled with critiques of religious intolerance and political tyranny, were promptly placed on the list. But something had changed. Banning a book by Voltaire didn't silence it. It made it more popular. To be on the Index became a badge of honor for an Enlightenment thinker, a proof that their ideas were so powerful that the old guard was running scared. Secret printing presses churned out forbidden books. Smugglers moved them across borders. In the salons of Paris and the coffeehouses of London, the latest banned book was the most fashionable thing to be seen reading. The Enlightenment's greatest project was the Asterisk Encyclopedion, a massive compilation of all human knowledge, from science to philosophy to the arts. Edited by Diderot and d'Alembert, it was a declaration that knowledge was not the property of a select few, but the common heritage of all humanity. It was a direct assault on the Church's claim to be the sole keeper of truth. The Church recognized the threat immediately. The Asterisk Encyclopedia Asterisk was placed on the Index. The Pope condemned it as a work of profound wickedness. But it was too late. The intellectual dam had broken. The ideas of the Enlightenment, of natural rights, of the social contract, of the separation of church and state, spread like wildfire. They fueled the American and French revolutions, toppling the very monarchies and religious structures that the Index had been designed to protect. The Church could ban the books, but it could not ban the spirit of the age. The world was changing. The printing press had made knowledge cheaper and more accessible. Literacy rates were rising. A new, educated middle class was emerging, hungry for ideas and skeptical of ancient authorities. The Index, which had been so effective in a world of scarce manuscripts and limited literacy, was becoming an anachronism. It was a medieval fortress in an age of intellectual cannon fire. The Enlightenment did not destroy the Index overnight, but it fatally wounded it. It exposed the Index for what it was: not a sacred shield protecting faith, but a rusty cage trying to imprison the human mind. And the mind was finally breaking free. The 19th century saw the Index fighting a desperate, losing battle against a new and powerful force, the novel. For centuries, the Church's primary concern had been theology and philosophy. But the rise of the novel presented a new kind of threat, one that was far more subtle and seductive. The novel did not attack doctrine with logical arguments. It crept into the heart with stories. It allowed readers to inhabit other lives, to feel other emotions, to see the world from different perspectives. And that, to the Church, was a dangerous form of empathy. Novelists like Honoré de Balzac and Stendhal wrote sprawling, realistic depictions of society, showing the moral complexities, the corruption, and the hypocrisy that lay beneath the surface of a supposedly Christian Europe. Their characters were not simple saints or sinners, but flawed, passionate, recognizable human beings. By presenting life in all its messy, contradictory glory, they implicitly challenged the Church's simple moral framework. Their books were added to the Index. Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, a story of a woman's desperate search for passion and meaning outside the confines of a suffocating marriage, was condemned for its supposed immorality. But its real crime was to suggest that a woman's inner life, her desires and her suffering, were worthy of serious consideration, a radical idea in a patriarchal world. The novel was a deeply personal, individual experience. It was a silent conversation between the author and the reader, a space where no priest could intervene. It fostered introspection and critical thinking. It taught its readers to question social norms, to sympathize with outcasts, and to imagine different ways of living. In short, it did everything the Church's system of education was designed to prevent. The Church's reaction was to condemn the novel as a source of moral corruption, a frivolous distraction that inflamed the passions and led the soul away from God. But the reading public was no longer listening. The novel was the dominant art form of the age, and people were hungry for stories that reflected their own lives and the changing world around them. The banning of a popular novel often had the opposite effect, turning it into a bestseller. The Index was becoming a joke, a list of the most interesting books you could read. The battle against the novel exposed the Index's growing irrelevance. The Church was still fighting the last war, the war of ideas as formal arguments, while a new war, the war for the human heart, was being won by the storytellers. The world of knowledge was no longer a small, easily patrolled kingdom. It had become a vast, chaotic, and wonderfully diverse continent, and the Index's old maps were useless. The gatekeepers had lost control of the gates. In the 20th century, the Index faced its final, insurmountable foe, modernism. The world had been shattered by world wars, revolutions, and the collapse of old certainties. A new generation of thinkers and writers emerged, determined to capture the fragmented, disorienting nature of modern life. Their work was challenging, experimental, and deeply skeptical of all grand narratives, especially the religious one. Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir were placed on the Index for their existentialist ideas. Existentialism proposed that existence precedes essence, that humans are born into a meaningless universe and are condemned to be free, to create their own meaning and values. This was the ultimate heresy. It rendered the Church's entire framework of divine purpose, original sin, and eternal salvation obsolete. If there was no inherent meaning, then the Church was not the provider of truth, but just one more storyteller in a world full of them. Novelists like André Gide and Alberto Moravia were banned for their psychological realism, their unflinching exploration of sexuality, doubt, and moral ambiguity. Their work refused to provide easy answers or clear moral lessons. They simply held up a mirror to the complex, often troubled, soul of modern humanity. The Church, which had always insisted on its ability to provide absolute moral clarity, could not tolerate such a reflection. Even scientists were not immune. Books on psychoanalysis, which explored the unconscious mind, and works on evolutionary biology, which cemented humanity's place in the natural world, were viewed with suspicion, as they offered alternative explanations for human nature and origins. But, by the mid-20th century, the world had changed too much. The global flow of information was becoming a torrent. The authority of the Church, weakened by centuries of scandal, schism, and scientific progress, was in decline. The index was no longer a fearsome weapon. It was a crumbling wall. It looked less like a noble defense of faith, and more like an act of intellectual desperation, an old institution shouting at a world that was no longer paying attention. The final nail in the coffin came from within the Church itself. The Second Vatican Council, a series of meetings in the 1960s, aimed at modernizing the Church, recognized that the institution had to engage with the modern world, not hide from it. In 1966, Pope Paul VI officially abolished the Index of Forbidden Books. After 407 years, the Silent War was declared over. The official announcement was quiet, almost bureaucratic. But it was a momentous admission. The Church was finally conceding that it could no longer control what the world was allowed to read or think. The prison for the mind had finally, officially, been dismantled. The official story is that the index is gone, a historical artifact. But is it? The abolition of the index in 1966 was not a declaration that the books on it were now considered safe or true. The announcement clarified that while the index as a formal legal document was abolished, it retained its quote, moral force. The faithful were still expected to avoid works that could be dangerous to their faith. The congregation of the index was not disbanded. It was simply renamed. It became the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, or CDF, the very same office that, for centuries, had run the Roman Inquisition. The name had changed, but the function remained: to be the Vatican's guardian of doctrinal purity. Today, the CDF no longer issues a public list of banned books. The methods have become more subtle, more suited to the information age. Instead of banning a book outright, the CDF will issue a notification or a doctrinal assessment. This is an official Vatican document that declares a theologian's work to be erroneous or incompatible with the Catholic faith. For a Catholic theologian, this is a career death sentence. Their books will be pulled from Catholic university libraries and seminaries. They will be forbidden from teaching at Catholic institutions. They are effectively silenced within their own community. The effect is the same as the old index, but the process is quieter, more internal, less likely to cause a public scandal. Furthermore, the Vatican's secret archives, now rebranded as the Vatican Apostolic Archives, remain largely inaccessible. Scholars are still required to request specific documents, and the Vatican retains the right to deny access. The vast collection of books and manuscripts, confiscated by the index over the centuries, has never been declassified or returned to the public domain. They remain in the Vatican's possession, a vast library of forbidden thought, hidden from the world. The spirit of the index lives on in other ways as well. In the ongoing debates within the Church over issues like sexuality, the role of women, and interfaith dialogue, the old impulse to silence and condemn dissenting voices is still very much alive. Theologians who push the boundaries are often met not with open debate, but with disciplinary action. So, while the physical list is gone, the underlying principle of the index, that some ideas are too dangerous for the faithful to encounter, and that the institution has the right to decide what those ideas are, has not vanished. It has simply adapted. The iron cage has been replaced by an invisible one, a cage of moral pronouncements, institutional pressure, and controlled access to information. The war on thought is not over. It has just become a Cold War, fought in the quiet corridors of the Vatican, in the footnotes of doctrinal assessments, and in the locked vaults of the apostolic archives. The silence is just as profound. The legacy of the index is not just in the books that were banned, but in the books that were never written. For centuries, the ever-present threat of condemnation created a climate of intellectual fear. A scholar contemplating a new theory, a philosopher exploring a radical idea, a scientist on the verge of a breakthrough, all had to ask themselves a chilling question: will this get me into trouble with the Church? This chilling effect is the most insidious legacy of censorship. It is impossible to measure the discoveries that were not made, the theories that were not pursued, the masterpieces that were not created, because their potential authors were afraid. How many Galileos chose to stay silent? How many Spinozas decided to burn their notes? How many Brunos decided that their ideas were not worth being burned at the stake for? The index created a massive, unquantifiable gap in the intellectual history of the West. It was a lost golden age of the mind, sacrificed at the altar of orthodoxy. We can see the echoes of this loss in the way scientific progress stalled in Catholic Europe for centuries, while it began to flourish in the more tolerant Protestant North. We can see it in the way philosophy became a handmaiden to theology, limited to merely justifying existing doctrine rather than exploring new frontiers of thought. This was not just a loss for the intellectuals, it was a loss for all of society. The suppression of new ideas in medicine, in political theory, in ethics, had real-world consequences, contributing to centuries of unnecessary suffering, political oppression, and social stagnation. The Church, in its attempt to create a stable, unchanging world of perfect faith, had inadvertently created a world that was intellectually impoverished and resistant to progress. When the index was finally abolished, it was not because the Church had suddenly embraced free thought. It was a tacit admission that the strategy had failed, and in failing, had done immense damage. The world had moved on, leaving the Church to guard a fortress of ideas that fewer and fewer people found relevant. The true tragedy of the index lies in this vast, silent graveyard of stillborn ideas. It is a reminder that the cost of censorship is not just the loss of the books we can name, but the infinite, unknowable loss of the books we can't. It is the sound of a library that was never allowed to be filled, the echo of a conversation that was silenced before it could even begin, the quiet hum of what might have been. What if the primary function of the index was not to suppress truth, but to steal it? Consider this. For 4 centuries, the most challenging, innovative, and potentially revolutionary books in the Western world were systematically collected and sent to one location, the Vatican. The Church did not always burn them. In fact, burning was often reserved for the most public and notorious cases. The real prize was the book itself. This created, over time, the most extraordinary library on earth. It was a collection not of orthodoxy, but of every heresy, every alternative science, every forbidden philosophy, every revolutionary political theory. The Vatican had created a library of the opposition, a comprehensive archive of every idea that could possibly threaten its power. Why? The simple answer is, know thy enemy. To effectively combat a heresy, you must first understand it. The scholars of the Holy Office, and, later, the CDF, needed to read the forbidden books in order to refute them, to prepare the arguments against them. But there is a deeper, more Machiavellian possibility. By consolidating all this forbidden knowledge in one place, under their exclusive control, the Church acquired a unique and formidable power. They became the sole custodians of the alternatives. Imagine a world where only one government had access to the writings of all its political opponents. Imagine a scientific institution that held all the research that contradicted its own theories. This is the position the Vatican created for itself. It could study the threats, anticipate the arguments, and even, when convenient, secretly borrow from the very ideas it publicly condemned. There are historical hints of this happening. Certain theological arguments that emerged from the Vatican in the 18th and 19th centuries seem to subtly incorporate and neutralize ideas from the very philosophers on the index. It was a form of intellectual judo, using the opponent's strength against them. This transforms the index from a simple tool of suppression into a sophisticated instrument of intelligence gathering and strategic control. The forbidden books were not just prisoners, they were informants, forced to give up their secrets in the silent interrogation rooms of the Vatican's archives. This secret library of heresy gave the Church an unparalleled strategic advantage in the ongoing war of ideas. They always knew what the other side was thinking, because they had their books. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the index. It wasn't just about making the world ignorant. It was about making the Vatican uniquely knowledgeable. It was about creating an asymmetry of information so profound that it would ensure the Church's intellectual dominance for centuries. The greatest secret of the library of forbidden books may be that it was, and perhaps still is, the Vatican's most precious strategic asset, a treasure trove of intellectual power, built one banned book at a time. The story of the Index is not just a story about the Catholic Church. It is a timeless parable about the relationship between power and knowledge. Every institution that seeks to maintain absolute control, whether it is a church, a state, or a political party, will eventually find itself at war with the free flow of information. The tools and the justifications may change, but the underlying impulse is the same. The index was justified as a necessary measure to protect the faithful from spiritual danger. In totalitarian states of the 20th century, censorship was justified as a necessary measure to protect the people from dangerous political ideas. In the digital age, we see new arguments emerging for the control of information, the need to protect society from misinformation, hate speech, or destabilizing narratives. The question is never whether the stated goal is noble. The question is always who gets to decide, who gets to be the arbiter of truth, who holds the power to place an idea on the index. The index operated on a simple, terrifying principle, that the institution knew better than the individual, that the flock was too weak, too foolish, too easily led astray to be trusted with unfiltered reality. Therefore, reality had to be curated for them by their wise and benevolent shepherds. This is the eternal argument of the censor. It is an argument born not of confidence but of fear. It is the fear that if people are given all the information, they will make the wrong choice. It is the fear that your own truth is not strong enough to win in a free and open contest of ideas, so the contest itself must be rigged. The legacy of the index is a warning that echoes through our own time. It warns us to be skeptical of any institution that claims to be protecting us by limiting our access to information. It warns us that the line between protecting the vulnerable and controlling the populace is dangerously thin. It warns us that the most effective form of tyranny is the one that convinces you to build your own cage, to fear the very knowledge that could set you free. We no longer have a formal index of forbidden books, but we have algorithms that curate our reality. We have media ecosystems that create ideological bubbles, and we have social pressures that create new forms of self-censorship. The war on thought has not ended. It has simply become more technologically sophisticated. The ghosts of the index still haunt our information landscape. They are the whispers that tell us some questions are too dangerous to ask, some books are too dangerous to read, and some truths are too dangerous to know. The battle is, and always will be, between those who believe knowledge should be controlled and those who believe it should be free. The index was just one long, dark chapter in that ongoing story. The abolition of the index did not lead to the great library of heresy being thrown open to the world. Instead, the silence simply deepened. The books and documents confiscated over 4 centuries remain in the Vatican Apostolic Archives, a collection of staggering size and historical importance. What secrets do these shelves still hold? What truths lie dormant in these pages, waiting for a reader? We can only speculate, but the possibilities are tantalizing. There are rumored to be lost gospels that were not included in the Bible, texts that paint a very different picture of early Christianity. Are there gospels that emphasize mystical experience over institutional authority, or that give a more prominent role to female disciples? Such texts were condemned as Gnostic heresies in the early centuries of the Church. The index was the final tool for ensuring they were wiped from the historical record. But were they all destroyed? Or are copies sitting in a climate-controlled vault, their contents a potential bombshell for Christian theology? The archives must also contain vast amounts of scientific and philosophical work that was suppressed. Are there notebooks from Renaissance scientists who, fearing the Inquisition, sent their research to the Church for safekeeping where it was promptly buried? Are there lost works of philosophers that were deemed too atheistic or too radical to be allowed to circulate? The index was at its most active during the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. It is almost certain that the Vatican holds documents that could rewrite our understanding of that pivotal period. Perhaps the most explosive secrets are political. The Vatican has been a major political player in Europe for 2 millennia. Its archives contain diplomatic correspondence, intelligence reports, and secret treaties that could shed new light on countless historical events, from the fall of kingdoms to the rise of empires. The index was often used as a political weapon, to ban the works of writers who challenged the Church's political allies or exposed its financial dealings. These banned books, read alongside the Vatican's own internal documents, could tell a very different story of European history than the one we know. The continued secrecy surrounding these archives is, in itself, telling. An institution that is confident in its own historical narrative would have no reason to hide the documents that contradict it. The fact that the archives remain so tightly controlled suggests that there are still books on that forbidden shelf that the Vatican believes the world is not ready to read. The index may be gone, but its prisoners have not been freed. They remain in their silent cells, a library of ghosts, a testament to the truths that power still fears, even after centuries of silence. The ultimate irony of the index is that it was built on a profound contradiction. The Church presented itself as the guardian of a truth so powerful and absolute that it was revealed by God Himself. Yet, the very existence of the index was a tacit admission that this truth was, in fact, incredibly fragile, A truth that is truly self-evident does not need to be protected by censorship. It can withstand any argument, any critique, any alternative. The fact that the Church felt the need to build a 400-year-long fortress of censorship around its doctrines suggests a deep-seated institutional anxiety. It is the anxiety of an authority that knows, on some level, that its claims cannot survive open and honest scrutiny. Why ban Galileo if the truth of Scripture is unassailable? His observations would simply be seen as a misunderstanding of God's true meaning. Why ban Voltaire if the moral teachings of the Church are self-evidently superior? His satires would fall flat, seen as the bitter ramblings of a cynical mind. The Index was an act of profound institutional insecurity. It was the strategy of an army that knows it cannot win on an open battlefield, so it seeks to control the terrain, to choose the weapons, and to forbid the enemy from even showing up. This reveals the core psychological function of dogmatism. A dogma is not a truth. It is a shield against the terrifying complexity of reality. It provides simple answers to life's most difficult questions. But for that shield to work, it must never be questioned. It must be protected from any information that might suggest the answers are not so simple, that reality is more ambiguous, and that other perspectives might have validity. The Index was the ultimate shield for the dogma of the Church. It was an attempt to create a closed intellectual system, a world where no uncomfortable questions could ever be asked, because the books that contained them were locked away. But reality cannot be contained forever. The truth has a way of seeping through the cracks. The history of the Index is the history of that shield cracking. Slowly at first, then all at once. It is a story that should give us hope. It shows that no system of control, no matter how powerful or long-lasting, can ultimately defeat the human desire for knowledge. But it is also a story that should serve as a permanent warning. It shows that the first instinct of a threatened institution is not to debate, but to dominate, not to persuade, but to prohibit. The Index is gone, but the institutional insecurity that created it remains a potent force in the world, in institutions both religious and secular. The desire to build a shield against uncomfortable truths is a permanent human temptation. What if the Index was never truly about the books? What if the books were just a proxy for the real target, a certain kind of person, a specific way of being in the world? Throughout its history, the Index disproportionately targeted the works of the individualist, the skeptic, the mystic, and the revolutionary. These are not just intellectual positions, they are psychological profiles. The individualist is the person who trusts their own conscience and reason above the pronouncements of an external authority. Think of the philosophers of the Enlightenment, who argued for the primacy of individual reason. Their work was a direct threat to an institution built on collective obedience. The skeptic is the person who questions everything, who demands evidence, who is comfortable with uncertainty. Think of the early scientists, who refused to accept dogma and insisted on empirical observation. Their work was a threat to an institution that demanded unquestioning faith. The mystic is the person who seeks a direct, personal experience of the divine, unmediated by priests or rituals. Think of the mystical writers who described their personal unions with God. Their work was a threat to an institution that claimed to be the sole intermediary between humanity and the sacred. The revolutionary is the person who sees the injustices of the existing order and believes that a better world is possible. Think of the political theorists and novelists who critiqued the alliance of church and state. Their work was a threat to an institution that was deeply invested in maintaining the status quo. These four profiles, the individualist, the skeptic, the mystic, and the revolutionary, represent the archetypal heretic. They are the people who, in every age, challenge the established order. They are the ones who think for themselves, who trust their own experience, who refuse to be silent in the face of injustice. The Index was, in essence, a systematic attempt to purge the Western mind of these psychological traits. It was an attempt to create a new kind of human being, one who was obedient, faithful, and unquestioning. It was a project of psychological engineering on a massive scale. By banning the books that nourished these heretical mindsets, the Church hoped to create a world where such people could not easily arise. If you never read a book that encourages you to think for yourself, you are less likely to do so. If you never encounter a story that encourages you to question authority, you are more likely to accept it without complaint. This is the deepest and most disturbing legacy of the Index. It was not just a war on books. It was a war on the human soul. It was an attempt to narrow the very possibilities of what a person could be, to shrink the vast and diverse landscape of human consciousness down to a small, easily managed garden of faith and obedience. The fact that this project ultimately failed is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The individualist, the skeptic, the mystic, and the revolutionary can never be completely eradicated. They are a permanent part of the human story, the eternal opposition to all forms of tyranny, the voices that will always, eventually, speak truth to power. The end of the Index was not the end of the story. It was simply the end of a chapter. The battlefield has shifted. The war for the mind is now being fought not with lists of banned books, but with algorithms, with data, with the very technologies that were supposed to set us free. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information. With a few keystrokes, we can summon more knowledge than was contained in all the libraries of the ancient world. But this abundance is a new kind of illusion. Our access is increasingly mediated by powerful, invisible forces. The algorithms of social media and search engines have become the new gatekeepers. They decide what we see and what we don't. They create personalized realities, filter bubbles, that reinforce our existing biases and shield us from challenging perspectives. They have learned to give us exactly what we want, and in doing so, they have made it harder to find what we might need. The uncomfortable truth, the dissenting opinion, the idea that could change our minds. This is a new kind of index, an index of invisibility. An idea is no longer banned. It is simply deprioritized, downranked, rendered invisible by the algorithmic currents. A book is not burned. It is simply buried on the millionth page of search results. A thinker is not excommunicated. They are deplatformed, their voice removed from the digital public square. The justifications are, as always, noble. We are being protected from misinformation, from extremism, from harmful content. But the question remains, who decides what constitutes harm? The tech giants of Silicon Valley, corporations with their own political and economic agendas, have become the new congregation of the Index. They are the new arbiters of acceptable thought, the new censors of our digital age. And like the Church of old, they operate with little transparency and no public accountability. Their indexes are the secret, ever-changing algorithms that shape our reality. This new censorship is, in many ways, more dangerous than the old. The old index was a blunt instrument. It was a public declaration of what was forbidden. You knew what you were not allowed to read. The new index is subtle, invisible, and personalized. We don't even know we are being censored. We simply drift through our curated information streams, convinced that what we are seeing is the whole world, not realizing that the walls of our intellectual prison have been rendered invisible. The spirit of the index is not a relic of the past. It has been reborn in the machine. It is the ghost in the code, the silent censor in the cloud. The war for the freedom of thought has moved to a new battlefield. And the challenge for our time is to learn how to see the walls of a prison that has no bars, and to find the courage to seek the truths that have been algorithmically condemned to the digital darkness. What is the ultimate antidote to the index in all its forms, past and present? It is not just the freedom to speak. It is the courage to listen. It is the cultivation of a mind that does not seek the comfort of conformity, but the challenge of complexity. It is the willingness to engage with the ideas we have been taught to fear. In an age of filter bubbles and echo chambers, the most radical act is to intentionally seek out the books, the thinkers, and the perspectives that challenge our own. It is to read the heretic's argument, not to refute it, but to understand it. It is to listen to the dissenting voice, not to mock it, but to find the kernel of truth it may contain. This is the true meaning of intellectual freedom. It is not the freedom to be right. It is the freedom to be wrong, to learn, to grow, to change one's mind. The index was built on the opposite principle. It was built on the fear of being wrong, the fear of contamination by a bad idea. It created a mindset of intellectual fragility, a faith so brittle that it would shatter upon contact with a single challenging thought. The antidote is to cultivate a mindset of intellectual resilience, a worldview that is strong enough to be questioned, a faith that is not afraid of doubt. How do we do this? We do it by building our own anti-index. We make a conscious effort to read the books that are not on the bestseller list, to follow the thinkers who are not amplified by the algorithm, to explore the ideas that are not popular in our own social circles. We learn to be comfortable with ambiguity, to hold opposing ideas in our minds at the same time, to recognize that the world is far more complex and mysterious than any single ideology can account for. We must become our own librarians, our own curators of reality. We must take back the power that we have ceded to the gatekeepers, whether they are priests or programmers. This is not an easy path. It requires effort, courage, and humility. It means admitting that we do not have all the answers. It means being willing to have our most cherished beliefs challenged. But it is the only path to genuine knowledge and to a free mind. The legacy of the index is a call to action. It calls us to be the readers that the censors have always feared. It calls us to be curious, to be skeptical, to be brave. It calls us to build a world where no book is forbidden, where no idea is too dangerous to be discussed, and where the human mind is finally and truly free to explore the infinite universe of what can be thought. The best way to honor the prisoners of the index is to read their work, to wrestle with their ideas, and to carry their defiant spirit of inquiry into our own lives. Imagine for a moment that the index was not a mistake. Imagine it was a necessary act, a desperate measure taken by an institution that saw itself as the last bastion of order in a world descending into chaos. This is not to justify the suppression, but to understand the fear that drove it. The Church Fathers who laid the groundwork for the index were the inheritors of a fallen world. They had seen the collapse of the Roman Empire, the dissolution of social order, the loss of a unified civilization. They looked out at a world of warring tribes, of competing superstitions, of intellectual fragmentation. In their eyes, the unity of the Catholic faith was the only thing holding civilization together, the only ark in a world-drowning flood of chaos. From this perspective, a dangerous idea was not just a theological error, it was a crack in the hull of the ark. A philosophical argument that led to skepticism could weaken the faith that held society together. A scientific discovery that contradicted Scripture could unravel the entire cosmic order upon which people built their lives. A vernacular Bible could lead not to personal enlightenment, but to 1,000 different interpretations, 1,000 different sects, and 1,000 new wars of religion, which is, in fact, exactly what happened during the Reformation. The creators of the Index may have seen themselves not as tyrants, but as guardians. They were the lonely sentinels on the walls of civilization, protecting the fragile flame of order against the howling winds of chaos. They believed that humanity, left to its own devices, would tear itself apart. It needed a firm, guiding hand. It needed a single, unifying truth. And they were willing to pay the terrible price of intellectual suppression to maintain that unity. This is the tragic vision that lies at the heart of all authoritarianism. It is a profound pessimism about human nature. It is the belief that freedom is a luxury that a fragile world cannot afford. It is the conviction that order must be imposed from above, for it will never arise from below. We can, and should, reject this vision. We can champion the messy, chaotic, and wonderfully creative power of freedom. But to truly defeat the spirit of the Index, we must first understand the terror from which it was born. It was the terror of a world without meaning, a society without cohesion, a universe without a center. The Index was a radical, and ultimately failed, attempt to build a permanent center, to freeze history, to create a final, unchangeable order. Its failure is a testament to the fact that life is change, that truth is a journey, not a destination, and that the human spirit cannot and will not be permanently caged, even if the cage is built with the best and most fearful of intentions. The story of the Index is a tragedy, not just because of the freedom that was lost, but because of the genuine, if misguided, fear that drove its creation.